So in the few minutes we have that remain here, does anyone have any questions about what they see on the course syllabus? What's on the horizon here? Well, I'll at least give you a brief rundown as I typically like to do at the start of class. So here we are on February 4th. We're going to be wrapping up our topic on human development, right? We'll be talking about the school years for children, as well as approaching the teenage years, and then all the way up into adulthood. And then on February 9th, right, we will have our exam one review session. And this will also when your first written assignment on gender differences will be due. And then finally, on February 11th is when your first exam will take place. Does anyone have any questions about that before we begin? Okay, well, if there's no further questions, then we can begin for today. So, where have we been and where are we going? Well, in our last class, we spent a lot of time talking about physical changes, social changes, and cognitive changes that are happening in infancy as well as early childhood. To that end, we learned that children are benefiting from this critical period known as neuroplasticity, right? The rapid firing and wiring of neural connections that help children learn, but also helps them recover from really severe forms of brain damage. We also learn that attachments and bonds are really super important in early childhood. To that end, according to attachment theory, we also learned that there are three different attachment styles: the secure attachment, the avoidant attachment, and the ambivalent attachment. Finally, towards the tail end of our last class, we also started introducing Piaget's stages of cognitive development, which proposes that cognitive maturation happens through a series of orderly stages. We discussed some key terminology and then ended by introducing the first stage of cognitive development, the sensory-motor stage, where children from birth up until about 2 years are primarily learning about their world through their senses, actions, and reflexes. Right? It's around this time in which children seem to put everything in their mouths, in part because taste and texture were one of their first ways of learning about the world. Again, remember for a newborn child, they can't see very well and they also can't move very well. So putting things in their mouth is one of their first ways of learning about this mysterious world that they've just been dropped into. We also talked about some really interesting studies that have been conducted within the sensory-motor stage. One of my personal favorites is the visual cliff study, where, as you can see in this image, a child is asked to walk across a seemingly visual cliff, but it's completely safe. And of course, we find that children in the sensory-motor stage express hesitancy to cross because they think there's a real drop off there and they could potentially get hurt. But if a parental figure or a caregiver is encouraging them to cross, we see that babies will forego their own better survival instincts to follow the wishes of the parent, showing some of the earliest signs of conformity and obedience. Finally, we find that in the sensory-motor stage, we see a lack of object permanence. And a lack of object permanence is associated with that phrase, out of sight, out of mind. So if you cover up a baby's toy, they will just stop looking for it because in their mind, it has completely vanished. Now, once babies start developing object permanence, it typically marks the end of the sensory-motor stage and the beginning of the next stage of cognitive development, the preoperational stage, where children ages 2 through 7 are able to now represent things with words and images, but their thinking is stuck in centration. Okay, so children ages 2 through 7 are now able to represent things with words and images, but their thinking is stuck in centration. So let me break that down for you all to make it a little bit clear. It's within the pre-operational stage that we start seeing an explosion of language take place. Children are now able to represent what they see in the world with words. They're also able to tell you what those things look like. And if you ask them what sounds those objects make, they can probably tell you, right? So if you ask your small child, what sound does the horse make, they'll probably be able to tell you, neigh. However, we find that their thinking in this stage is stuck in centration. In fact, centration is the primary hurdle for children to overcome within this stage of cognitive development. So another way to think about this is that if object permanence was the primary hurdle for children to overcome in the sensory-motor stage, centration is the primary hurdle for children to overcome in the pre-operational stage. But what is centration? Well, centration refers to children's tendency to only think through problems from one singular perspective. In other words, they're having a difficult time thinking through problems from multiple different perspectives simultaneously. Okay? They're centrating on just one perspective at a time. And there's a lot of different illustrations and examples of centration in children's thinking. One of the more famous illustrations comes through what is known as the conservation problem. Now, in a typical conservation problem, a small child is shown 2 glasses of milk. So very similar to this small girl here in the pictures in the bottom of the slide, where in the first phase of a conservation problem experiment, the child is asked which glass has more milk, right? And of course, most children and adults get this right. The glasses have an equal amount of milk in them. But then in phase 2, the researcher then pours one of those glasses of milk into a taller but slimmer glass. And then in phase 3, the researcher then asks the child which glass has more milk. And this is where children in the pre-operational stage typically give the wrong answer. They'll say that the taller and slimmer glass has more milk, despite the fact that they just saw the researcher pour all of that other glass of milk into that taller and slimmer glass. This is evidence of centration, right? Because the child is just focusing on one aspect of the problem. They're only focusing on the height of the glass. They're not also considering the relationship between the height and the width of the glass. Okay. If they did consider both the height and the width of the glass, they'd be able to recognize that there's still an equal amount of milk in these glasses because the quantity of these objects remains the same despite there being changes in its shape. Now, when children are able to recognize that, we see that they're starting to move beyond centration. Okay. Any questions on that conservation problem and how it's evidence of centration? Was someone trying to speak? Okay. Well, let me give you another illustration of centration. Consider something known as egocentrism. Now, in your everyday lives, you probably think of egocentrism as instances where people may act a little bit superior to others, or they may be a little bit self-absorbed. And that certainly may be one way in which you can define egocentrism. But psychologists take a much broader definition. We consider egocentrism to be any instances where children are only considering their perspective when trying to solve a problem. And of course, egocentrism is evidence of centration because children are only focusing on one perspective when trying to solve a problem, their own perspective. They're not also considering another person's perspective when trying to solve problems. Okay. And there's a lot of really innocent illustrations of egocentrism in children's play. For example, when small children in the pre-operational stage, especially around age 2, 3, and 4, may try to play hide and seek, when they go to hide, they may walk over to the middle of a room and put a box over their head, right, in plain sight. Or maybe they'll do what my child does sometimes, and he'll take a blanket and just throw it over his head into the middle of the room, right? And he's very in clear, plain sight. But in his mind, if he can't see, I also can't see him. In other words, he's projecting his perception onto me. if he can't see, I also can't see him. Okay. In other instances, and you can see a picture of my child here, he'll also run over to maybe a corner of the room, or maybe sometimes just in the middle of the room, and he'll cover up his eyes with his hands. Because again, if he can't see, I also can't see him. And here's me snapping a picture of him when he's trying to do this. But let me give you an experimental study associated with this. So in one study now known as the E study, small children in the preoperational stage come into the lab and they're asked to draw an E on an index card in such a manner that if they tape that index card to their foreheads, other people will be able to read it. However, what we find is that children in the preoperational stage will draw that E on the index card in such a manner that they can read it when they look at it, but when they tape it on their foreheads, it's backwards to everybody else who's looking at them, right? Evidence of centration. They're not considering somebody else's perspective when trying to solve this problem, okay? Now, we find that when children start moving beyond centration, they start developing what is known as a theory of mind. Okay, theory of mind refers to instances where children are now able to recognize that other people have unique thoughts, feelings, and intentions that are somehow different from their own. Okay, they're able to recognize that other people have unique thoughts, feelings, and intentions that are somehow different from their own. In other words, we're starting to see the earliest signs of perspective taking, being able to place themselves in another person's shoes, metaphorically speaking, and feel what they feel. Consider that prior to developing this theory of mind, children may be very quick to assume that their emotions are widely shared. That if I'm sad, other people must be sad. And if somebody else is sad, perhaps they're sad for reasons that would make me sad. Okay. They also may assume that their knowledge is common knowledge, that if I know something, other people should know that thing too. Let me give you an example of a test that we like to employ to see if children are beginning to develop a theory of mind. It's called the false belief test. So in a false belief test, children come into the lab and they're placed at a table with a researcher. And the researcher shows that child a closed box of crayons and simply asks that child, what do you think is in this box of crayons? And of course, children and adults all typically give the same answer. There's crayons in the crayon box. What else would there be? But then the researcher opens up the box and shows the child that there are candles in the crayon box. So it violates their expectations. But now in phase 2, underneath the table, the researcher pulls out a stuffed animal, right? Let's say the stuffed animal is Snoopy, okay? And the researcher tells the child that Snoopy hasn't seen what has just transpired here. What do you think that Snoopy thinks is in the crayon box? And this is where we see children in the preoperational stage typically give the wrong answer. They'll say that Snoopy must think that there are candles in the crayon box. But of course, that's wrong, because Snoopy hasn't seen what's just transpired here. What they should have said is that Snoopy will think that there are crayons in the crayon box because Snoopy hasn't seen what's happened. In other words, they're projecting their knowledge onto Snoopy. Because I know that there are now candles in the box, Snoopy must think that too. And of course, when children begin to move beyond centration and develop this theory of mind, they're better able to take Snoopy's perspective and recognize that because Snoopy was underneath the table, he has different knowledge than I. Okay. Now, a lot of early estimates suggest that children start becoming able to engage in perspective taking like this by around age 4 or 5. And we do find that in tests like this with stuffed animals, children by around age 5 start getting the right answer more consistently. But we find that taking the perspective of an actual human being is actually quite a bit more difficult, because human beings have actual thoughts and feelings and complex emotions and intentions and so forth. So we find that children really don't get good at mastering this theory of mind until about age 7. Which perhaps not coincidentally is around when the preoperational stage ends. However, even though children begin to master this, it doesn't mean they always use it. often it's easier to default back to the easier form of understanding other people's minds, egocentrism. And adults do this too. In fact, we even find in adult populations that even though adults clearly have the ability to engage in perspective taking, they're more likely to default back to the easier form of understanding people, egocentrism. To give you an analogy, you all have phones, and your phones supposedly all have the ability to make phone calls. And you could call somebody, but oftentimes you default back to the easier form of communication, which is texting that person, because calling somebody requires investment and commitment and energy and time, and you can't multitask quite as well. The same things with perspective taking. It takes time and energy and cognitive resources. It's easier to default back to the easier form of understanding, egocentrism, in the same way that it's easier to default back to the easier form of communication, texting somebody. And that's the way you want to think about this. Okay. Any questions on the pre-operational stage at this point? Any questions at all?
Can you explain the theory of mind again? You said it's when children, no, you said it's the unique thoughts, feelings, and I didn't get the last part.
Right. So theory of mind refers to this idea that children are able to recognize that other people have unique thoughts, feelings, and intentions that may somehow be very different from themselves.
Okay. Thank
Right.
you.
The way you can think about it, as I put in this bullet point here, is it's very close to this idea that children are now starting to engage in perspective taking, is how you may want to think about it.
Okay. Thank you.
Excellent question. Any other thoughts on this before we continue? Okay. So once children begin to move beyond the pre-operational stage, by around ages 7 through 11, children then enter into the concrete operation stage, where we find that children are now able to think quite logically about concrete concepts. Okay, they're able to think quite logically about concrete concepts. So of course, the operative word here is concrete. But what does that mean? Well, it's around this age range in which children are squarely positioned in school, right? And they're solving a lot of complex problems related to English, reading, and math. Focusing on math here for a second, we find that children are able to solve really complex math problems, but often with the aid of a concrete physical object in their environment, such as their fingers or pen and paper. In other words, they still have a slightly difficult time solely doing math in their heads, right? They may still need the aid of a concrete physical object to solve various complex math problems. Despite this, because these children have moved beyond centration, they start becoming really quite good at doing linear math transformations. Right? So it's around this time in which children may be asked to convert in between fractions, decimals, and percentages. And being able to master that concept requires recognizing that even though that metric is coming in different forms, right? It could be a fraction, a decimal, or percentage, the quantity of that metric is still the same. Now, you'll notice that that logic is also very similar to the logic of the conservation problem, which requires children to recognize that just because the glass of milk is in a taller and slimmer glass, it still has an equal amount of quantity as the smaller, fatter glass, right? That the quantity of these objects remains the same, despite there being changes in its form and shape, okay? Next, by the time children reach age 12, and of course moving into the teenage years, they enter into the formal operation stage, where they're now able to think quite logically about abstract concepts. So of course, the operative word here now is abstract. So to put this another way, whereas children in the concrete operation stage are really quite good at solving complex math problems with the aid of a concrete physical object like their fingers or pen and paper, children in the formal operation stage become really quite good at doing math solely in their heads without the need of a concrete physical object, right? They can abstract it and represent it in their minds, okay? In fact, it's around this time in which children start becoming really quite good at pondering complex hypotheticals, right? Hypotheticals are these what if statements where, if I engage in that behavior, then there may be some negative consequences for me in the future. To give you an example of this, it's around the formal operations stage in which children start becoming really good at playing chess, right? That's why I have a picture of two children playing chess here, because chess requires pondering a lot of complex hypotheticals and thinking several moves in advance, right? If I take that pawn, then my opponent could potentially take my queen, and now my entire strategy is disrupted, okay? And this future-oriented thinking that they're doing, thinking several moves in advance as one example of that, also shows that children are now able to make a lot of temporal judgments, right? Temporal judgments refer to being able to consider both the past, the present, and the future, okay? Children in the formal operation stage are able to recognize and have appreciation about who they were in the past has made them who they are in the present. And all of their values and attitudes and strengths and weaknesses have downstream consequences on who they're going to be in the future, right? They're making temporal judgments about their past, their present, and their future. And as an example of this, it's around this time in which children start making really logically informed judgments about what they want to be when they grow up, what they want their careers to be. Now, this isn't to say that children age 3, 4, and 5 can't tell you what they want to be when they get older. But typically for a child age 3 and 4, they're making those judgments very reflexively, right? Maybe they saw firefighters on TV and then suddenly they want to be a firefighter, right? Now, maybe they do end up becoming a firefighter, but maybe not, right? Their judgments are much more impulsive and they're much more reflexive and based on what they're seeing in the present moment. But by the formal operations stage, we find that children can make judgments about their careers that are based more on logic and an intellectual assessment of their strengths, their weaknesses, their values and attitudes and beliefs. Okay. Finally, this future-oriented thinking that they're engaging in also helps them engage in self-control. Right? Self-control refers to delaying immediate impulses in the service of long-term future rewards. And we find that children who are better able to engage in self-control reap a lot of really fantastic life outcomes once they reach adulthood. They end up being healthier. They have better jobs. They make more money. They have higher levels of academic attainment. They even live longer lives than people who are more impulsive. In fact, all of you right now are engaging in a lot of self-control, right? School is one big delay of gratification. You could be out there right now, probably making more money, having fun with your friends, but instead you're in school taking classes that you probably don't want to be taking. Hopefully not this one. Hopefully you enjoyed this class. But regardless, you're delaying your immediate gratification in hopes that there's going to be a payoff in the future. Right? That's the promise of education. In fact, our entire society and culture is based on this notion of self-control, right? There's tons of examples of this. Even in the most basic principles of saving and investment requires delaying immediate impulses in service of long-term savings and investments in the future, okay? In fact, to drive this point home further, and I'm speaking now as a parent, not just as a psychologist, if there was one psychological skill for me to nurture in my child, and I can only pick one, self-control would be at the top of my list. And that's saying a lot because there are a lot of really important psychological skills to nurturing your child, like perspective taking as one example. But that is a testament to how important self-control really is to gearing your child to have success in the future. Okay. Any questions on any of that?
You gave a really good definition on self-control. Can you just go over that one more time?
Sure. So self-control refers to delaying your immediate impulses in the service of long-term rewards later on in life.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Any other questions on this? I want to make sure all that's clear. Okay, so now we reach the teenage years. We reach adolescence. Adolescence can be considered the transition from childhood to adulthood. Okay, the transition from childhood to adulthood. And it's during adolescence that we see a lot of rapid changes in teenagers' physical development, in part thanks to puberty. Right? When boys and girls reach puberty, we start seeing a lot of marked increases in their height and their weight, and of course, with the production of sex hormones. Now, as I think I mentioned in our topic on nature v nurture gender differences, both men and women have testosterone and estrogen, but men have a little bit more testosterone, women have a little bit more estrogen. And those sex hormones also have downstream consequences on teenagers' sex drives, right? So we know that there is something to this idea of the horny teenager, because as all those sex hormones are flowing through their veins, it's certainly increasing their sexual attraction to one another. But these sex hormones also play another very important role. They have a role in the development of boys and girls' sex characteristics. Okay, so for teenage boys, we start to see the development of muscle mass, broader shoulders, a deeper voice. Whereas for teenage girls, we start to see the development of breasts, or we start seeing girls start to have the kind of curves that young women have. Okay. Now, we find that boys and girls typically reach puberty at different times. In fact, girls typically reach it a little bit earlier than boys. Girls typically reach puberty around ages 10 or 11, whereas boys typically reach puberty around ages 12 or 13. Additionally, the landmark events for when boys and girls reach puberty is vastly different, as I'm sure you know. For teenage girls, their landmark event is very clear, right? It's typically their first menstrual period. Whereas for teenage boys, their landmark event is markedly less clear. Though researchers argue that the landmark event for puberty for teenage boys is typically the presence of the first wet dream. Okay. Now, as has been a reoccurrent theme in this entire topic on human development, is that there is a lot of variation in which children reach their developmental milestones. As we discussed in the past, some children talk a little bit earlier than others. Others crawl a little bit earlier than others. Others walk a little bit earlier than others. Well, same in the teenage years, right? Some boys and girls reach puberty a little bit earlier or later than others. And although this natural variation is natural, there are a lot of social consequences for teenage boys and girls if they have a very early or late puberty, okay? Especially for teenage girls, because their landmark event for puberty is especially noticeable to others, right? We're talking about things like the development of breasts and when they reach their first menstrual period. Teenage girls often face a lot of self-esteem issues as well as victims of bullying if they're a little bit late to the puberty party. In fact, if a teenage girl recognizes that she is the only girl in her cohort that hasn't reached puberty yet, she may start becoming bullied. She may start questioning herself, saying things like, what's wrong with me? Why haven't I reached puberty yet? Why am I not in bras yet, or training bras, or my friends are in regular bras? I haven't even had my period yet. What's wrong with me? Am I even a woman? And you can see how that may start affecting a teenage girl's self-esteem quite pronouncedly. Okay. However, there are some environmental circumstances that could throw young girls into an exceptionally early puberty. And I'm not just talking about being thrown into puberty maybe a few months early or even a year early. I'm talking about a young girl reaching puberty as early as age 6 or 7. And that is not normal. Okay. And we find that one environmental predictor of this is home instability. We find that when young girls are in a home environment that's very threatening and precarious, right? Maybe they're around a lot of physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, that nature will throw these young girls into an excessively early puberty. And of course, as psychologists, we want to know why. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that the reason they're being thrown into an early puberty is that nature is trying to get these young girls as reproductively ready as possible so that they can reproduce their genes and bear children before the environment may take their lives. So what we see here is another very interesting interaction between nature and nurture. That while nature has this blueprint for when boys and girls should typically reach puberty, right? For young girls, it's around age 10 or 11. If the environment is particularly influential, it will jumpstart or alter nature's natural time course for when that should happen by throwing them into an excessively early puberty to get them as reproductively ready as possible to bear children and reproduce before the environment takes their life. In other words, we see even more evidence that nature has designed our minds and bodies to promote survival, and in this case, reproduction, above all costs. Any questions or comments or insights on that?
That's crazy.
Yeah, that's really sad. Makes me sad.
Yes, it's very sad. It's horrible, actually. From a psychological end of the spectrum, certainly we've gained a lot of insight into how the human mind works and how nature and nurture both interact to alter nature's natural time course. But yeah, it really is quite sad to see what happens here. So, any other thoughts on this? Now, interestingly, I will say we don't see this same kind of thing happen for young boys, right? So the environment in this case doesn't necessarily throw young boys into an excessively early puberty, but it will throw young girls into an excessively early puberty, which is interesting. Okay. Finally, we also see a lot of changes happening with the brain. Now, although many teenagers will be very quick to assert that they're adults now, neurologically speaking, they're not quite there yet. In fact, we know that the brain doesn't formally finish maturing until about age 25. And the parts of the brain that are still immature in the teenage years is typically the frontal lobe. And you may remember from our lecture on the biology of the mind that the frontal lobe is associated with everything ranging from planning, self-control, time management, organization, and so forth. However, we find that in the teenage years, the limbic system is fully mature. And as you may remember from our lecture on the biology of the mind, the limbic system broadly is associated with emotionality and impulsivity. So in other words, the limbic system is fully mature to tell teenagers to go, you should do that thing, go, go, go. Whereas the frontal lobe hasn't matured enough to put the brakes on and say stop as much as it should be able to. So what we have here is an instance where teenagers on average make riskier decisions than we see in adult populations. Now, this isn't to say that adults don't make risky decisions. They definitely do. This is just what we see on average. Another way to think about this is that although teenagers have the ability to think critically and logically and make great decisions, they have the capacity to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean they always do. And they may cave into their immediate impulses thanks to the limbic system, such as engaging in risky sex, drug, or alcohol-related behavior. Okay. Any questions on physical changes happening in the teenage years?
Okay. You said limbic system is more emotional. Can you go over that a little bit more?
Right. So the limbic system is broadly associated with impulsivity and emotionality. Right. You may remember components of the limbic system being like the hypothalamus, which is associated with regulating our needs, wants, and drives and impulses, right? Telling you to go get that thing, get food, get water, get sex, right? Get it. whereas the amygdala is associated with a lot of emotional impulses. Okay. So we find that broadly, this mature limbic system is telling the teenager to go do that thing, get what you want. But the frontal lobe hasn't matured enough to put the brakes on and say, hold on, you should stop and not do that thing because it may not be a good idea. Right? Which leads us to the conclusion that on average, teens are a little bit riskier than adults. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much.
Great question. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay. So yes, we do see a lot of rapid physical changes in the teenage years. And because a lot of these rapid physical changes are very noticeable to other people, we find that teenagers start becoming increasingly concerned about building their social identity, right? Their sense of self, particularly in relation to other people. Okay, their sense of self, particularly in relation to other people. In other words, teenagers are not just interested in building their personal identity. I mean, they certainly are. Developing your personal identity is very important in your teenage years. Figuring out your attitudes and your beliefs and your personality and what you want to do as a career, right? Who am I? But developing your social identity is becoming increasingly more important, right? Figuring out who you are in relation to other people. Okay. In fact, this is a point in which social comparisons are at their highest point. Teenagers are constantly comparing themselves to others to see how they stack up in terms of their intelligence, their athleticism, and their appearance. And all of these social comparisons may certainly make teens a little bit more self-conscious about their image that they're presenting to other people. Right? So teens do engage in a lot of image building tactics, perhaps more so now than they ever have done before. And to give you some examples of this, we find things like tanning, dieting, smoking, and drinking. Okay. But you'll notice that all of these image building type of strategies could have some negative consequences to the self. Right? Tanning certainly may increase the likelihood of developing skin cancer. Dieting, although very healthy, if it's in the hands of a teenage girl who may be showing some symptoms associated with eating disorders, that may not be very healthy. And smoking and drinking have negative consequences to the self that I'm not going to belabor the point. But a little bit more on smoking and drinking in a different way, we find that teens also start becoming much more interested in being able to show to themselves and other people that they can be an adult, right? Remember, the teenage years are all about this in-between stage of childhood and adulthood. And being an adult may seem very desirable to me. And what better way to show other people that I can be an adult than to engage in activities that are largely constrained to adult populations, like smoking and drinking. Now, to teens' credit, they do have a lot more adult-like cognitive capabilities, like organization and planning and time management. And they do have a lot more adult-like responsibilities, right? They may be working a part-time job. They may be driving themselves to school, especially in the later teenage years. But their lives still contain a lot of childlike elements. They're still living at home with their parents. They're eating their parents' food. They may have a curfew. They may have an allowance. They may still be taking the school bus to school, whatever the case may be. So because of these contrasting life experiences, for some teens, there ends up being a tug of war between parent and child, where the parents are trying to hold on to whatever fleeting control they have over the child's life, where the teenagers are trying to show their parents that, hold on a second, have some faith in me. I can do more than you think I can, right? Strive for independence and autonomy, while all the while still trying to garner acceptance from their peers and their friends and develop their social identity. And what better way to garner acceptance from their friends at school than to model their friends' behaviors? Right? Maybe you have found yourself from time to time mimicking your friend's vocabulary or mimicking your friend's speech mannerisms, right? You start picking up, just whether you know it or not, the vocabulary of other people around you. And that's not the only way you may model your peers. You may model their attitudes and their beliefs and their preferences, right? We are typically prone to modeling people that we like and admire, which is increasingly not becoming our parents and is increasingly becoming our friends. So, with that in mind, we also find that teens often model smoking behavior, right? Some behaviors that may not necessarily be so useful and functional to the self. And although a lot of early research suggests that if a parent smokes in the household, the teen is likely to smoke, and we still do see that, certainly from time to time, modeling their parents' smoking behavior. We find that an even stronger predictor of smoking behavior is if the friends smoke, right? If the friends smoke, the teen is especially likely to smoke because that may be a useful strategy for me to garner acceptance from my peers, fit in with the group, or even be an adult, is the idea behind that. So there is something to this common notion that parents and teachers and educators have told you growing up is that you got to hang out with the right crowd because who you hang out with can have a significant influence on the types of attitudes and beliefs and behaviors that you yourself may start engaging in. Any questions on that before I continue?
This is more of a comment, but I find in today's generation, I feel more people model themselves based off people they see on social media and who they can relate to.
Exactly. Exactly, right? Especially more now than ever before, we're seeing a lot of influences from social media.
Well,
And
as we all know, social media is one of the most powerful forces on this planet.
yes, especially right now, it could be a very strong vehicle and tool for good and change and social justice oriented movements, but it could also be a vehicle for hatred and anger and hurting other people, bullying other people, cyberbullying and the like, right? So in many ways, it's kind of a double-edged sword. And when teenagers jump into these platforms, which we find their involvement in these platforms really booms in the teenage years, it can start affecting their self-esteem and their emotions. In fact, many parents often worry, right? That my teen is on this like roller coaster of emotions where, they can be in a good mood and they're happy and cheerful. And then they look at their phone and all of a sudden they're depressed and they're even depressed for the rest of the day. Right. So something happened in that like 2 to 3 seconds that they glance at their phone that just completely ruined their day. Right. And we find that when teens start becoming really invested in a lot of these social media games, like pursuing likes and comments on social media platforms like Instagram or in other cases, Facebook, it can start to take a toll on their sense of self, right? Because those platforms have manipulated the currency of self-worth. What it means to be a valuable person is how many likes and comments you can garner on social media. And if those likes and comments aren't coming in, well, that may start affecting how I view myself. I may start thinking, what's wrong with me? Am I not doing something right? Am I not interesting? Are my friends more exciting and valuable than I am? Or maybe I have a relationship partner and I notice that my partner likes an attractive photo of a member of the opposite sex. And I saw that they like that photo. And now that really bothers me. And I start questioning my value and the integrity of my relationship with my partner, and whether my partner's thinking of abandoning me or breaking up with me and pursuing this other person they've seen on social media. Right now, my self-esteem is really on the floor. Okay. So we know that social media is having a large impact on people's thoughts and feelings and their actions. And of the social media platforms that have received a lot of attention, certainly Instagram and Snapchat are at the top of the list. Snapchat in particular for its Snap Streak feature, where two people have to send a picture back and forth at least once a day to build and maintain Snap Streaks. And although that may seem somewhat benign, what Snapchat has essentially done here is manipulated the currency of friendship in the same way that likes and comments have manipulated the currency of what it means to be a valuable human being. What it means to be a good friend on Snapchat is who can build and maintain the highest snap streaks possible. And if you break those snap streaks, well, you're not a good friend. So for people who have streaks in the hundreds and thousands, they may have a lot of anxiety about breaking these snap streaks. right? What is my friend going to think of me if I break our 1,000 snap streak? Are they still going to like me? Are they still going to be friends with me? Are they still going to talk to me? Right? That may not make me feel very good. It may even make me feel distressed. This matters to people. There are very real emotions at stake, very real relationships at stake, very real feelings of self-worth at stake. And I know when I talk about this, I kind of sound like that guy who's trying to tell you to get off your phones. And that's not the impression I want to make to you all. I'm a millennial. Okay. I grew up with a lot of this stuff in many of the same ways you have, just for me a little bit later on in my life. In fact, when I was in college, I had an ex-girlfriend who was very, very heavily involved in Snapchat. Okay. So much so, right? The streaks and the hearts. And we used to get into fights and arguments, right? That I would break the snap streak accidentally because I just wouldn't keep up with it, or I didn't have a heart on Snapchat. And it got so bad that we ended up breaking up because of Snapchat. And when I say that out loud, it sounds absurd to think about. But that is how much these social media platforms matter to people. And it can contribute to a lack of productive conversations between older and younger generations of people, where older generations of people will just tell the younger generations, hey, just get off your phone. This is stupid. You should just drop these games. It's not a big deal. But for the younger generations living in these worlds, these often aren't just silly games. This is their life. Comments, questions, or insights?
That's actually crazy.
Yeah, I was about to
That
say
is
that's
crazy.
Wait, what specifically is crazy?
Your girlfriend
That's
broke up with you because of Snapchat.
Oh, yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, that is insane. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, I agree.
Really, I thought this happens somewhat commonly. I would think there's a lot of other people out there that are really invested in this and get upset with others if they break streaks or don't have hearts. Is that not the case anymore? Do people not care about this?
It is. It is, but I just tend not to involve myself with people that, go that deep into social media like that.
Well, this is the thing about me and my group of friends. Like, me and my friends, we all have social media, but we don't really post stuff on it ourselves. We kind of like monitor it and make sure that it doesn't like rip itself apart or something.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of just do that.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense.
Which is actually a lot safer than, actually, getting into it. Like, like we're like we have social media, but like, we never really just post stuff on ourselves. Like,
Gotcha. Well, a lot of people also have like Finstagrams, right? The fake Instagram accounts where they post different pictures that they don't put on their regular Instagram account with their close circle of friends. In fact, so for the past few years, I've been assigning this digital well-being written assignment that you all will write as well towards the halfway point of the semester. Haven't assigned it yet, but I've been slowly reminding you that that's coming your way, right? To keep in mind all this stuff we're talking about here for your papers. But I've been noticing as the years have gone by that the social media platform that's really been influencing students the most, right, in the negative way, right, affecting their self-esteem, their sense of depression, anxiety, and so forth, has really been Instagram. Right, there's apparently a lot of toxicity on Instagram, and you're constantly seeing all these photos after photos of your friends living these seemingly perfect lives and these seemingly perfect relationships and these seemingly perfect bodies and so forth, and that begins to take a toll on mental health and so forth. Or as I mentioned prior, if your significant other likes a post of an attractive person, that starts affecting you and whatnot. Like, those are the kinds of things I read in students' papers when I assign that assignment. Do you all have the same kind of impression?
I mean, I have blown up on other girls for commenting on my boyfriend's pictures, but I don't blow up on him for like stuff like that. I don't know, but because I don't take it that serious. But I can see how other people do.
Gotcha. Anyone else want to chime in?
I usually just like.
my
Sorry, you go ahead.
Oh, thanks. When me and my girlfriend first started dating, I also have anxiety. So it was a very anxious moment for me if I would see them like commenting on another girl's post, because I'm like, oh my gosh, like a whole bunch of things would go through my head, but then I had to realize that that's not the case and that they can have friends who are girls too.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's sometimes a hard thing to stomach, right? Because your instinct is telling you, oh, they're going to leave me for this other person.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
It's very surreal. It's a very surreal feeling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does someone else want to chime in here?
Yeah. I would usually just like stay out of social media because I would just stay away because why do you want to look through photos to if it's gonna harm your well-being, your health?
Right. Well, I mean, for some people that can be very hard, right? So although it may seem easy when you say it out loud that, yeah, I can stop this. I can even delete my account, no big deal. But then like the days go by and you start feeling disconnected from your world and you have the fear of missing out and you feel like other people are continuing their lives without you and you don't know what's going on. And it's for many people a lot harder than it sounds just to ditch social media or even significantly reduce your involvement. Right. So those are the things I want you to think about as well when you eventually write your papers, right? How easy is it to really reduce the amount of involvement or even just cut it off completely? Or is it possible in this interconnected world we live in, even during COVID? Very difficult. Any other comments before we move forward?
I mean, I think I've had my most success keeping my relationships off of social media and just just going about it regularly.
Gotcha. Yeah, a lot of people use it as a source of news, which certainly can be good and also certainly not so good. In fact, there's a lot of misinformation that spreads on social media, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, so certainly there's different ways you can use social media and ways that work for you, so you can use it as productively as possible. Okay, well, there's no further questions on this topic. We need to move into adulthood. Okay. Now, although a lot of research on human development has focused a lot on children, the truth is we spend the vast majority of our lives as adults. So we also have to talk a little bit about how changes are happening in adulthood throughout the years. And before we get into those changes, I want to talk about a concept that has intrigued me over the past few years, and that's something known as a subjective age difference. This is the difference between how old one is and how old they feel. Okay, so maybe you've had an older person in your life say something like, I may be 80 years old, but my mind is in its 20s, right? So my parents say that all the time, right? They're not 80 years old yet, but they say things like that, my mom in particular. However, what is old, right? There tends to be a lot of shifting standards on what old actually is, where we tend to be a little bit reluctant to ever declare that we are the old ones. It's always the people older than us that are actually old, right? I think my parents are old, but I've always thought my parents were old. But as I've been alluding to, if you ask my parents, hey, are you guys old? They're of course saying, no, we're not old. It's the people older than us that are actually old. And we find in research that this reluctance to ever declare that we are the old ones often has a lot to do with this cultural premium that our society places on youth, right? Being young is good, right? Am I old? Right? I don't think I'm old. In fact, I'm 29 years old. But when I have conversations about people younger than I about music interests, well, then I start feeling kind of old when I recognize that they haven't heard any of the music I used to listen to when I was a child, right? But yes, our society does place a premium on youth. But clearly there must be some cutoffs, right? Objective ranges for when young ends and old begins. And we do have these benchmarks in psychology, but if you're looking for very precise cutoffs for these kinds of things, you're not really going to find it here. We have very broad age ranges. But with that said, let me take you through adulthood throughout the years. In the 20s can be considered young and emerging adulthood, right? Where people in their 20s still kind of feel like they're in this in-between stage of childhood and adulthood, where certainly they have many more adult-like responsibilities than they had when they were a teenager, right? They may have their own apartment, they're paying their rent, they're paying bills, they're getting their own groceries, they're working a full-time job and so forth. But their lives still contain some childlike elements. For many people in their 20s, they may still be in school, right, in college, which still kind of gives them that feel that they're a kid in school. Others may still be on their parents' health insurance plan that you can stay on until you're 26 years old. So, because of these somewhat contrasting life experiences, people in their 20s sometimes question if they've really reached adulthood yet. They still kind of feel like a kid. The 20s, to a large extent, are all about finding your identity, figuring out your attitudes and your beliefs and still your career path, right? It's about messing up occasionally and still having the time to fix things, right the track, and put yourself on the course where you can find the kind of career or family to present you with the kind of stability that's promised to you in your 30s, which marks the beginning of middle adulthood, which is also where we start to see a lot of declines in athletic ability, right? In fact, there's a reason why in the NBA and the NFL, sports players often retire by their late 30s, early 40s, because they're just really not the same guy at that point, right? Take Peyton Manning. Like, Peyton Manning is like the perfect example of this. Peyton Manning was amazing with the Colts. And even those first few years with the Broncos, he was still really incredible. But that last year they won the Super Bowl, they really didn't win because of Peyton Manning. They kind of won in spite of him, right? Age really hit Peyton Manning like a ton of bricks. And that's not to take anything away from Peyton Manning. I love me some Peyton Manning. But Tom Brady, on the other hand, has kind of been...
Eli sucks.
Eli sucks. Right. Go Giants. I'm not a Giants fan. But in any case, Tom Brady's been kind of an enigma in this whole equation. Okay. He's still playing at age 43 years old. For those of you that haven't even heard yet, right? You don't watch football. He's back in the Super Bowl for the gazillionth time. And although his critics have often asserted that Tom Brady has often benefited from having a great coach and a great system with schemes that work for him, he's still somehow succeeding, right? But that said, Father Time will come for Tom Brady, right? Father Time has come for everyone. It's just likely that Tom Brady has taken such great care of his body and is probably a really great leader and game manager and still has the ability to make the requisite throws, that even though he's falling at such an incredibly high altitude that has allowed himself to maintain that level of athleticism and playmaking ability that it didn't quite happen the same way for Peyton Manning. But Father Time is coming for him, I promise you. Middle adulthood also can be characterized as individuals starting to move into what is known as the sandwich generation, where not only are they taking care of their own children, but they're also taking care of their own aging parents, who, by the way, are having their own slew of health problems, on top of the fact that they're also struggling with their own personal life stressors, such as work and job and career or money and their children, and they're managing this work-family balance and so forth. And it's because of all of those factors that happiness is actually at its lowest point in middle adulthood. But it's not all doom and gloom. In fact, by 65 plus, individuals enter into late adulthood, and we find that their immune systems are actually really quite good. In fact, there's a reason why older adults seem to be somewhat immune to really common colds and minor illnesses relative to small children that get sick all the time. Their immune systems have seasoned. But this doesn't mean that they're not immune to larger health problems, right? Certainly older adults are very susceptible to heart problems, liver problems, and a slew of various cancers. But this is also a time when they may even be dealing with deaths in the family, right? If their parents are still alive, they're definitely getting older. They may have lost a brother or a sister or a cousin, right? They may even be dealing with crippling loneliness. In fact, that's one of the biggest hurdles of late adulthood, loneliness. Fortunately, if older individuals do have a happy and healthy and supportive social network with their kids and their grandchildren, they can thrive, right? They focus on the little things in life. They may even stop to smell the flowers. They prioritize family or career or emphasize religion, and they love their grandchildren. In fact, their grandchildren are often the highlights of their day, speaking from firsthand experience, my child's grandparents just light up when they see him. It's like the best part of their day. So if older adults can cultivate a happy and healthy and supportive social network, there's no reason why these years still can't be your golden years. Okay. Any questions on adulthood throughout the years? This broad synopsis. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about the aging brain, right? The brain is now getting older. It's definitely not still benefiting from neuroplasticity, and we're starting to see some slowdowns of a lot of basic cognitive abilities. One of which is processing speed, right? They're just not reacting in the same way, at the same quickness and sharpness that they used to. Learning also starts to slow. In fact, we know that processing speed starts declining as early as the mid-20s, which not coincidentally is also around the time in which the brain finally has finished maturing. So another way to think about this is as soon as the brain is done maturing, it's all downhill from there, right? Now, I'm 29 years old, so statistically speaking, my processing speed has started to decline, but I don't feel that way. In fact, I feel as about as sharp as I was when I was in my early 20s, but it's probably happening. The way to think about this is that in your 20s, you're falling from such an incredibly high altitude that you may not even recognize that processing speed until later on in life, when you start getting into your 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and so forth. But it is happening. In fact, it really starts dipping by the time you reach your 70s and 80s, which is why older adults end up becoming much at greater risk for car accidents. Because being able to maneuver in high traffic situations requires the kind of reaction times that older adults may not have at that point. Okay. We also start seeing that memory holds pretty stable up until about the 40s. But it's not quite that simple. In fact, we do see some differences between recognition and recall. So let me define these two terms. Recognition refers to retrieving information with the aid of a reminder or a cue. Okay, retrieving information with the aid of a cue or a reminder. So this would be somewhat analogous to a multiple choice test, right? So if I give you a question, you may not know the answer to that, but you have 4 reminders that could spark your memory: A, B, C, or D. Contrast this with a test of recall, where you're asked to retrieve information from memory without the aid of a cue or a reminder. This would be somewhat analogous to an essay-based test, where I just give you a question and you're asked to just go to town and write as much as you know without the aid of any kind of cue. We find that tests of recall are markedly harder than tests of recognition, and it shows as people get older. In fact, as you can see in this figure here, although recognition stays pretty stable across the lifespan, recall dips, especially as people start entering into their 40s and 50s and 60s. And it can kind of give older individuals those senior-like moments. Finally, we see that IQ is relatively stable across the lifespan, which gives rise and supports a lot of common stereotypes that older adults are really quite wise. They have a wealth of life experiences. They've been through a lot, in part because they've lived a very long time. And hopefully all those life experiences may aid them in making good decisions. In fact, we find that older adults who come back to college can do just as well as their younger student counterparts. And although their processing speed may be a little bit lower, and it may take them a little bit longer to learn some types of information, we know that once they got it, right? And older adults can do just as well as their younger student counterparts. Okay. Any questions on the aging brain?
Does that kind of go along with the phrase "use it or lose it"? Like,
You can.
like if you don't do it while you're young, it's going to be a lot harder to learn when you're older, stuff like that.
You could make that case. You can make that. I would say that applies especially to processing speed, right? So it will become a little bit harder to learn. But I would say the phrase that more closely applies to IQ is actually that you can teach an old dog new tricks, And it may take them a little bit longer to get there, but once they got it, they got it.
Okay.
Any
Right.
other thoughts on this?
You defined something for recognition and recall. Can you go over that one more time?
Yes. So recognition refers to retrieving information from memory with the aid of a cue or a reminder, right? So something is jogging your memory. So on a multiple choice test, it would be A, B, C, or D as cues that could remind you of, oh, that's the right answer. You recognize it. But with tests of recall, you're trying to retrieve information from memory without the aid of a cue, right? So this would be your essay-based test where you just have the question and you just have to write your essay without any cues or reminders. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great question. Any other thoughts on this? Okay. So where we're going to end today is by talking about social development in adulthood. And there's way too many changes happening in social development for me to cover virtually everything. Rather, I'm going to focus on some of the more interesting parts of this. And one interesting part of this to me is the midlife crisis, which, if it occurs at all, happens around the 40s and 50s. So for those of you unfamiliar, the midlife crisis refers to these kinds of tendencies where older adults may wake up in the morning and have that YOLO kind of experience where they see their first gray hair, or they recognize that maybe the best years of their life are behind them and they need to live their life to their fullest potential. So they go out, they make risky purchases, risky decisions, kind of like this older gentleman here with the sports car and the clothing that looks like he's getting ready to go clubbing like it's the 1960s. But it turns out that we have somewhat of mixed evidence for the midlife crisis. Okay. And if it exists at all, it's less likely to occur for older adults naturally getting older and is more likely to occur for significant changes in their lives. So we're talking about a death of a loved one or going through a divorce, right? It's those kind of traumatic life events that could trigger some midlife crisis-like tendencies where they decide life is short and I need to take advantage of my life to its fullest potential, and shows some of the kinds of reactions that we see that resemble a midlife crisis. But again, I don't want to tout this like we know this exists for sure because the evidence is somewhat mixed. We also find, as I suggested prior, that older adults enter into what can be considered the sandwich generation by their late 30s, 40s, and 50s, where not only are they taking care of their own children, but they're also taking care of their own aging parents, on top of their own personal life struggles, right? So the reason why it's called the sandwich generation is because they're in the middle, right? Their kids are on one end and their parents on the other, and they're taking care of two different generations of people. And because of all the stressors associated with that, we find that happiness is at its lowest point in middle adulthood. So if you think life is hard when you're a teenager in your 20s, wait until you reach your midlife where life really starts kicking you in the rear. So how do older adults deal with all these life stressors? Well, love is a big part of it. In fact, we find that older adults who can go into happy and healthy and loving and supportive relationships and marriages thrive, right? Their health is better, their happiness is higher, their satisfaction and meaning in life is through the roof. They live longer lives. But older adults who are in long-term toxic relationships definitely don't fare well. Their physical and mental health is lower. They even die younger, in part because all that stress starts breaking down the body. And when your body starts breaking down and your immune system gets worse, that could make you more susceptible to illnesses later on in life and shorten your lifespan. So another way to think about this is if you're in the sandwich generation and there is stress all around you, the last thing you need is for your life partner to be the central source of that stress. Which is why we find that there is a lot of divorce in middle adulthood. And there are a lot of predictors of divorce, far more than we have time to go over in this class. This is not a class about divorce. This is intro to psych. So in this broad run through that I'm going to give you of some predictors of divorce, in no way does it justice. You can have an entire class on this subject alone. But to give you at least some ideas, we know that cohabitation does play some role, right? Instances where people live together before marriage. And we think that cohabitation predicts divorce in part because people who are cohabitating are initially less committed to each other to begin with. And there may still be some loose ends in that relationship that haven't been tied up. So if they get married, those loose ends may potentially start unraveling. It could potentially predict divorce. Not only that, but we also find that when passion goes down and the sex starts drying up, those are also really big predictors of divorce, right? It's important for people in long-term relationships to keep their relationship fresh, try new things in bed, try to recultivate some of the emotions and feelings you had for your partner, even back when you were on the honeymoon stage, right? You may remember the honeymoon stage where everything your partner did, right? They had a halo above their head. They couldn't do any wrong. And they had all these quirks and things about them that were weird, but were endearing, right? Maybe your partner always sang in the shower every day. And in the honeymoon phase, that seems like really endearing and cute. But then 20 years after living with that same person, it really starts pissing you off, right? And all the little things your partner does starts irritating you. You may even start pushing blame around and the communication breaks down. And you may even declare that your partner is the reason why you can't have nice things, right? The goals are now misaligned. Those are the kinds of things we look at. And although a lot of people in dissatisfied relationships may declare that maybe having children will solve the root problems of their relationship, people in dissatisfied relationships may be very quick to realize that they're going to be rudely awakened, literally and metaphorically speaking, when they're sleep deprived and they're arguing about whose responsibility it is to take care of children. We find that
I have a question.
Yes.
Like, if your parents are in your 40s and they start having a bunch of kids, like, randomly, is that a sign of, like, a midlife crisis?
You could potentially draw those conclusions. I would hesitate to say that, especially since we already have somewhat mixed evidence for the midlife crisis. It's likely there are other reasons why they're doing that, aside from trying to YOLO and live their life, try to like recultivate the early years of their life. I mean, it's possible. And I don't know the nature of that relationship to give you an accurate response, but I would also consider other things as well, right? What are their priorities? What are their attitudes? What are their backgrounds? Did something happen in the past where they couldn't take advantage of the things they wanted to take advantage of when they were younger that they're trying to do now? So I would look at a lot of different things. Do you want to add on that a little bit?
I mean, sure. It's like, like they went together for like most of my life. Then they got together when I was like 18, and like I have like a twin brother and like a little sister. So like they had like another baby, like last year, and now they're having another one.
Gotcha.
I guess it's like my sign that I gotta move out soon, and I'm getting replaced. No, seriously, I think I'm getting replaced.
Really?
Yeah, they had two. They had one kid having another one. And like me and my brother, I think we're like 20 now, but they're like, like they're just giving us that look. It's like, what the heck?
Interesting. So this is the decision they made together. They seem relatively happy with it. Is it bringing them meaning and satisfaction and joy and so forth?
I have no idea.
It can also be done by accident. That happened to me. I have a 19, 18, and then a 1-year-old.
Ah, okay. Yeah,
not an accident, but it wasn't planned.
Right. That's a fine line, right? Accident or not. Yes, for sure. That happens too. But regardless, we find it for parents that do get along to begin with, right? So they do have a solid relationship foundation, right? Those are the kinds of instances where children can bring an immense degree of joy and happiness and meaning and satisfaction. But for parents who don't initially get along together and don't have that solid foundation, children can also bring a large amount of stress that can still make the relationship seem quite rocky. In fact, some parents may decide to still stay together for the kids despite the fact that there's a lot of chaos in the household. And it's important during those instances, if there is a lot of arguing and a lack of communication, and there may even be social and emotional turmoil happening in the household because the parents aren't getting along, to go into family therapy as soon as possible. Because if you do make the decision to stay together for the kids, despite the fact of a very unstable home environment, you want to try to mitigate the trade-offs associated with that unstable home environment, right? Because the last thing you want is for that decision to stay together to still be having a lot of negative impacts on the child's ability to succeed later on in life. Of course, there's a remarkable amount of benefits for a child to have two parents in the household, right? But there are also trade-offs associated with having two parents in the household that are presenting a very precarious and potentially, in some extreme cases, threatening home environment, right? And if those parents aren't getting along to the point where it's impacting the child's ability to focus in school, make friends, it's affecting their self-esteem, that's not good either, right? And that's where therapy has to step in to try to find ways to reconcile the relationship, salvage the marriage, and mitigate any negative consequences that may be happening for the child. Okay. Any questions on anything regarding social development? Anything at all from anything we talked about today?
Wait, I have a
This is
question.
only
Like when I'm
loosely-
writing a paper,
Oh, you can go.
you first.
All right. Well, I was just gonna ask. This is only loosely related, but what about miscarriages? Don't those take like a special kind of toll too on marriages?
It certainly can. In fact, some marriages don't survive after a miscarriage. And there could be still some arguments. There still could be hard feelings. There could even be a lot of hesitancy to even have another child. It feels like you're replacing the one that you had. And for parents, that could be very difficult to get through. So yes, certainly miscarriages will be a very trying time for any parents dealing with that. Right. And some certainly do try again and the marriage can maintain itself, but others sometimes don't. It really depends on the background of the parents, how well they cope emotionally, with depression, anxiety, and so forth. So yeah, it could either go either way. Does someone else have a question? Did someone else have a question? I think someone had a question about the paper. Okay, well, if there's no further questions, then we can end for today. As always, feel free to email me, reach out to me if you have any questions. Remember, your papers are on the horizon. Okay, so start thinking about writing those papers on gender
Wait, I do have a
differences.
question actually.
Okay,
Yes,
yes.
Question.
Yes.
How many pages do we have to write?
Okay, so the papers are a minimum of 3 pages of content, not including the title or references pages.
Oh, thank God. Okay, that's reasonable.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So again, reach out to me if you need help writing your paper. I can give you tips. I can give you strategies. I can read sections of your paper, right? Good luck. I'm here to help you succeed. Have a great rest of your day.
Have a good day, Professor.
You too, fam. Stay easy.
Take care.
You do the same, Professor. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good one.
You too.